Hello, I'm Denise Yassine. Most of you already know me, but I'm the social studies chair. And I thought that rather than take your time during a meeting, I would put together this PowerPoint and just talk to you about my biggest takeaway from the assessment conference that I attended. I know that oftentimes when we think about the objectives, the skills, what we want our students to know, understand, do, the content, the learning targets, if you've attended the conference, you heard those words or you've heard people talking about them, sometimes it can make our heads swim trying to think about all of those words and what they mean for our curriculum. But at the conference, those two words, learning target, really resonated with me. And when I think about all of the things that I ask my students to do, framed by the learning target that I want them to hit in order to gain mastery, that made a lot of sense to me. And so learning targets, those two words, was powerful to take away from the assessment conference. And so that's what I'm really going to talk to you about. Oftentimes as teachers we either create or we inherit some awesome projects. They're fun, the kids love them, they're constructing their own knowledge and they're engaged. But if we don't think of those projects in terms of learning targets, if they're just fun, then we run the risk of possibly missing the mark that we really can get for our students to do these exciting and fun projects, but do them in a way where they are really hitting the learning target in a meaningful way. So we all have objectives in our map within our curriculum that we look at when we're planning our lessons. And so for me, in planning a lesson about helping my children understand the geographic challenges that the Mesopotamians faced, I thought, wow, doing a 3D map would be great for that. But I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just a 3D map of paint and yarn, but that it was embedded within that project were those learning targets that I wanted my children to be assessed on and then to have mastery of. And so looking at the objectives and having those guide the conversations that we had during the project and after the project made it more powerful. So then this 3D map became a project to reinforce the learning targets, not just a fun project to add some pizzazz to the unit. So when we finished the project and we put it on the bulletin board, I didn't want it to just disappear in their minds. So instead we returned to the board often to make sure that the to-do list of skills and objectives that we had, our learning targets, were constantly met, and we would use the map to reach those learning targets, to talk about the different aspects of the geography that had an impact on the start of Mesopotamian city-states within the land between the rivers. And so that was the change for me, just really making sure that the project was meaningful and based on those targets. Now the good news was it translates beautifully to the assessment. Whatever kind of assessment that we give our students, whatever way we learn whether or not they have mastery over the skills that we've taught them, if we embed those learning targets within the projects that we have, then when the students read the questions, they can immediately have a mental picture of the map that they created, and the questions become so easy because we've talked about them, we've felt the land, we've realized that there weren't a lot of trees, that they would have their walls made out of bricks made out of mud, because there weren't a lot of trees, there weren't a lot of rocks, and we proved that when we made the map. So that was one aspect of turning that project into a combination. Another example, my students were also learning about what happened after they became city-states and what made the civilizations. And one of the objectives was for the children to understand that historians classified civilizations with 7 cultural universals. So they had a flow chart like this where The target was that they would be able to give me examples of the ways that these civilizations had social structure, government, religion, and so on. So a fun project would be to make their own 3D city-state. But embedded in that were those 7 cultural universals that they were going to be tested on later. And another formative assessment would be to create a poster that goes along with the 3D project, so that it's another way for me to make sure that the project isn't the focus for the students only, but that they're really understanding that it was a way for them to understand those cultural universals. So they start to plan, they begin to build, and then the little details. And on the surface you might see cuteness and clay and color and craftiness, but each of the things that they built had to do with those 7 characteristics of civilization. So we have the ziggurat here, we have the irrigation system, we have the watchtower and the wall, the palace for the king, the houses. These houses are whitewashed because we learned that the upper class whitewashed their walls, and their farms. And so for the students, when asked, they could tell you that this ziggurat represented religion, irrigation was a form of technology, the walls and the watchtowers were their security, the palace was a symbol of their government, right next to the ziggurat, because they believed that the gods appointed their king. And the social divisions, the houses were different sizes and in different locations because of social divisions. And then the stable food supply represented by the crops and the farms. So the final product, on the surface, it may not look like that much, but when the students talk to each other and they share with the class what they built, they're reinforcing those learning targets. And then the posters, once again, another assessment where I can make sure that formatively they understand what historians use to classify a civilization. And again, on the test, when they're asked to give an example or description of those characteristics, most of my students felt like they knew so much they wanted to use another page because they had more than one example, all because of the activities that we did, very firmly rooted in our learning targets. So again, the multiple choice aspect, they understood because of the conversations we had around the project, and they knew very well and were very well prepared to show mastery on that summative assessment. So in conclusion, my big takeaway, if I've created or inherited a project or an activity, I need to know what learning target or targets it addresses. And it's not enough for me to know, I need my students to know what those learning targets are. And we need to talk about it often as they're doing the project and return to it often. If the project or the activity doesn't meet any learning targets, then I need to question its value as part of my curriculum. And when asked, I want my students, when they're asked, what are you doing? I don't want them to say, making a map with yarn and paint. I want them to say, I'm making a map to better understand the geographic challenges the Mesopotamians faced. And that can only happen if I make that a focal point for myself as the teacher and for them as students. So I hope you found this helpful. I know you're all doing a fabulous job with your projects, but I know that as I started to think about those learning targets, it changed the way I approached my projects and deepened them for myself and for my students.